Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another presentation from William Gairdner. War on the Family, excuse me, is the series of books. Sorry, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, because Wolfenut is much more familiar, and of course I'm hunting up already and very conscious right now. But no, he's here to talk to us about his books and his experiences. William, I'm going to just hand over to you because I feel like I'm not doing you justice at all. Sorry.
Ready to go?
Yeah, I am.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me again. What we're going to talk about today is a section of my book, War Against the Family, which is called Looking After Their Bodies. And I'll just start with a couple of brief epithets supplied by experts in the field of fitness and health for young students. And maybe before I do that, I should say that this is a special interest of mine. When I was very, very young, I was a very sick young boy, confined to bed a lot of sickness. And I gradually started to come out of it. But the thing that really turned my head in terms of loving sport and fitness, besides the fact that I was at a boys' private school where it was mandatory, was when I won my first ever 100-yard race against some older boys. And I started to dream, like, wow, maybe I could get really strong and fit and put this terrible business of sickness behind me. And I think now that I'm an old man, that was in fact a lot of the core motivation of my life. And then later in my life, after I finished teaching at York University in Toronto, teaching English literature, that is, I went into a business that my dad created called the Fitness Institute. This was a business that had 3 50,000 square foot clubs in the city of Toronto by the end of the day, that is. And he was having all kinds of financial troubles with it. And he came to me and said, listen, you have a PhD from a great university. You're a former Olympic athlete. We need you to come help the family. So I got involved with the business for about 15 years. The only reason I'm telling you this is because fitness and health is a special interest of mine. And I guess you could say because I have 5 kids and 16 grandchildren, it's also a special interest as a family man. So the question I want to ask about and speak to is what happens to the health and fitness of our kids once we put them in government schools. Here's some answers from other people. Professor Don Bailey says, for the ordinary child, physical fitness seems to be a decreasing function of age from the time when we put them behind a desk in our schools. In other words, you can mark the physical decline of children from the day they go to public school in particular. And I'll just comment on that too, because private school, when I went to one of them, all sports were mandatory. As I said last time, you couldn't get out of it without a doctor's note. And that was true all across Canada. That's lightened up a little bit since then. It was never true in public schools. And public schools, other than a mandatory fitness class until grade 9, say, team sports, competitive sports, all that sort of thing was optional for the kids. And some of them did it, of course. There's some very good, tough public school teams out there. But in a school of 2,000 students in a big public school, not very many of them are doing those sports. Whereas at the private schools, there's still a kind of, what are you going to call it, an underlying philosophical approach to the idea that a good school should be looking after the minds, the bodies, and the spirits of the kids. All 3 of those things. And you don't just drop the body out of the equation, the body being, as I think we hear in the Christian religion, the temple of the soul. So here's another quote from a U.S. governor on a commission on fitness, who said, in many ways, the fitness boom, and we all know what that was. It kind of started in the early 70s, and suddenly we had marathons all over the world with thousands of adult runners in them and so on. And we called it the fitness boom. And this fellow says, in many ways, the fitness boom is a myth. And whatever part of the boom does exist, it doesn't trickle down to our children. That's a very damning statement, and I think largely true. And this is also, despite the fact that in Canada, where I'm from, about 90% of Canadians, which is an overwhelming majority, believe physical education should be mandatory for all children throughout the school years. Now, how do you explain that in a democratic system in which taxes are taken forcibly from your pocket to fund public education, and that the vast majority, I think 90% is the vast majority, insist on physical education being mandatory in those schools? It isn't. It's really strange to me that no one asked the question, how come it isn't? And in the next talk that we do, I'm going to explain some of the reasons why I think it isn't. Part dealing with this.
The obesity rising, but sorry, carry on.
Hello?
Yeah, well, you're probably going to get to it later. I was just going to say about the obesity rising, it's, even more
I'm getting to it. Yeah.
Important. Yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah. At any rate, I start by saying a clear case can be made that the state of the minds, spirits, and bodies of our nation's youth is the future of the nation itself. But what happens to their bodies, the once hallowed temple of the soul, in the public schools? Does the sound mind and a sound body philosophy hold sway? And I think the best that can be said, as we shall see, is no. Their bodies are left to decay at the same unsettling rate as their minds and values deteriorate. And yet the overwhelming majority of Canadians, as I said, the great bulk of parents, feel very strongly that not just physical education, which is like a classroom thing, but physical activity should be mandatory in our public schools. They're paying the shot in the taxes, as I said, so why is it they can't get what they want? Incidentally, some years ago, my wife and I ran a kind of sports fair at the private school that our children were enrolled in. It was a kind of a fundraiser thing over 2 days, like a sports fair with lots of games and contests. And we even got a lot of the parents involved, in sort of arm wrestling. If you lose, you throw $1 in the pot and that kind of thing. But it was great fun, and there were hundreds of students involved and lots of parents. And I was out in the field when they were doing some kind of baseball throw competition. And I started chatting with one of the parents of kids at this private school. And I said, what do you do? What's your walk of life? He said, I'm a public school teacher. And I said, wow, I said, isn't this amazing what's happening here today? He said, yeah, it sure is. And I said, you could do this at your school. He looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, are you kidding? He said, not in 1,000 years. I'm not saying nothing happens at public schools. There's some very good public schools, especially in good parts of our cities. But generally speaking, when the 3 o'clock bell goes off, everybody gets out of there, except a small minority who do like to do sports and, do them voluntarily and so on and so on. But what I'm addressing here is the thousands of students, many thousands of students who don't have to do anything physical year after year. So that's the kind of background. And now I want to ask listeners to do a kind of mind experiment with me, because I don't think the research is satisfactory on this question. You can torque your studies one way or the other to get the kind of results that you want, depending on the ingoing values and so on. So I say instead, let us imagine that we are faced with an irrevocable choice of moving forever to one of 2 new countries. The first country I call Fit Country, and the second one is unfit country, each of which is the same in every respect except in its attitude towards health and fitness. So imagine which country you would prefer for your own children. In fit country, the people seem to have a deep, almost moral interest in vigorous activity. Very few smoke. Children consider that to be uncool. Smoking in or near the vicinity of a school during school hours meets with suspension. Almost no one is obese. The parks and schoolyards seem busy with active people of all ages most of the daylight hours. All school children are required to do an hour of vigorous activity every school day, including team sports at some level. Playgrounds ring with excitement and with the cheering or occasional scolding of teammates. Junk food is forbidden on school grounds. Not only are most children a bit taller than the generation preceding, which is the result of excellent nutrition and exercise, they are also fitter and stronger than their parents were at the same age. In fit country, the public philosophy of health is basically a sound mind and spirit and a sound body. And the result is that millions of the nation's children have high confidence in themselves. They work at superior academic levels and show a vigorous attitude towards life's challenges. Multi-level competitive sports teach everyone the joy of striving and improving, the humility and grace necessary in losing, and the bonds of teamwork. These schools have negligible violence and crime, and there are few emotional problems among students. As this country's population ages, the most impressive overall health result is an extremely low level of degenerative diseases, or what are called lifestyle diseases, among the people. Even those who do get sick tend to recover faster, and they spend far less time in hospital. The nation's health costs are lower, and therefore taxes are lower. Okay, so that's fit country. Now let's look at unfit country. You can imagine what I'm going to say. The people are the same in every respect as those in fit country, except in their attitude towards physical life. Here you notice immediately that the young and old alike are increasingly sedentary and obese. Shockingly, the children in unfit country experience a rapid loss of body strength and cardiovascular capacity from the age of 15 onward. And when I finish this little part, I'll explain some of the studies which illustrate that. A diminishing percentage of adolescents can run a mile in a reasonable time. The children, by all biochemical and physiological measurements, are physically old, although chronologically young. Clearly, all school children in unfit country eat increasing and alarming amounts of fatty and fried foods and refined sugars, and many have early signs of cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure. Most, this is shocking, most cannot do a single chin-up at age 14, whereas their parents and grandparents easily could. Nevertheless, quite surprisingly, the vast majority of children in the public schools are not required to do any physical exercise, and even what they do is on close inspection, usually below the minimum level required for a positive health effect. In unfit country, the government controls public education and is unresponsive to parents who are annoyed and disenchanted because they cannot persuade their schools to make sport and fitness mandatory. So they have given up. They cannot get their children interested in health and fitness because, quote, none of their kids' friends are interested, unquote. So if they can afford it, they move their children into private schools. And if they cannot, they become resigned to what they see as government-imposed educational bad luck and lethargy. So that's my way of saying try to imagine these different options for any society. There's likely broad agreement that only the most jaded individual would choose unfit country. And of course, fit country is an ideal, a critic might argue. But then so is unfit country. In unfit country, the controlling ideal is the least physical effort. And here there is the least concern for the health and fitness of citizens and the least public school duty to promote physical well-being. Fit country is simply the opposite. It sees striving for optimal health and fitness for oneself and one's family, and ultimately for the pleasure of it, as part of the striving for excellence. It says that a school that does not strive in this way is no school at all. It's an expensive holding tank for unformed students and spiritless, unambitious teachers who have given up their ancient commitment to the well-balanced life. Well, so what we're talking about here is human capital. And I should say, at least in schools run by the state, that we're not doing much to sustain the nation's most important sustainable resource, which is its children. And furthermore, any nation that turns out generations of increasingly weak children will eventually reach a condition of maximum adult weakness. Is that our ideal? Well, I say forget the reports and studies. Instead, let's have a vigorous national debate on the controlling educational ideal under which we hope to operate. If it helps at all, here's what some of the reports are telling us. Until about 1850, most human beings died of infectious diseases. And then over the past century and a half, increasingly good basic medical research, vaccination, sterilization, and so on, have conquered or have at least held at bay most of these diseases, only to see them replaced by what we call degenerative diseases that spring primarily from, guess what, inactivity, poor nutrition, and poor health habits. The World Health Organization has called the shocking increase in these diseases, quote, the greatest epidemic mankind has ever faced, unquote. Well, I don't know whether it is or not, but that's a pretty distinguished organization to say something like that. Today, about half of all hospital beds in the developed nations are occupied by people suffering from one or another of these degenerative, or what some people call lifestyle diseases, or what some other people call diseases of choice. They've chosen to get sick in this way by spurning the prior modes of life I've been talking about. And diseases of choice means you can avoid them by a change in your personal behavior. Such diseases used to happen only to the very old and immobilize them against their will. But today they happen to whole societies in the measure that we shrink from regular and vigorous physical activity and we spurn nutritious food. And they are striking younger and younger age groups, including school-age children who eat poorly and do not exercise. This trend is especially strong in Canada and the United States, where fast food, high prosperity, and work-saving technology are the most prevalent. So I don't want to drive everybody crazy with studies, but I'm quite shocked myself at how pertinent some of them are. So let's look at a few. During the Korean War, half of the autopsies performed on U.S. soldiers who were killed in action showed heart disease and plaque, or fatty deposits, on their arteries. Their average age was 22. Later, of 100 22-year-old soldiers autopsied in the Vietnam War, 45% showed medium artery damage and 5% showed severe artery damage. These were not old men. They were of university age. However, Korean and Japanese soldiers, all much leaner and fitter and on a very different diet, showed no such traces at autopsy. The point is that heart disease is not something which just happens to most people. It's an organic disease that most sufferers can accelerate themselves or postpone as long as possible through lifestyle. The same is true of many types of cancer. at least half of the cancers that we know about are lifestyle-based. And high blood pressure is another killer. Many now famous studies, such as the Framingham study at Harvard and the Paffenbarger study at Stanford, have illustrated that individuals who eat a lot of fatty foods and refined sugars and burn fewer than a specified number of calories in physical activity weekly are at very high risk for degenerative diseases. And these findings now apply to children of all ages. We are just now discovering that the young are not protected from degenerative disease if they adopt the lifestyles of diseased people. Now here comes a section called the fattening and drugging of North America. Dr. John Meyer of Harvard discovered in the 1950s that among young students, inactivity, not necessarily overeating, was a major cause of obesity. In fact, some studies have shown that Americans are eating a bit less, but are still getting heavier because they are doing less than ever. Several studies have shown that obese and overweight schoolboys and girls spend 2/3 less time in physical activity than do normal weight students. One of the ways I read about where they tried to figure this out was they set cameras up on public swimming pools, and they just let them run all day and whatever for weeks on end. And then they analyzed what the cameras were showing, and what the cameras revealed was that the fattest kids were in the water the least. They were primarily sitting on the edge of the pool with their legs in the water or going in for a bit of a dip to cool off and getting out again quickly, whereas the leaner kids were almost always in the water, playing tag, chasing each other, swimming, jumping, whatever. So this kind of underlined the thesis that it's not just about the food that they're eating, it's about cutting down on activity. Other studies have shown that many commercial dog foods are more nutritionally balanced than the average real diet of North Americans, and that there has been a dramatic increase in the consumption of refined sugars to about 140 pounds per capita per year. And that was, at the time, was a 50% increase since 1920. Combine this with a 50% reduction in natural carbohydrate foods such as breads and fruits, and the fact that soft drinks are consumed at the annual rate of 40 gallons per citizen. From 1965 to 1980 alone, alcohol consumption in North America went up 186%. It has since leveled off or even fallen somewhat, with the drop perhaps related to after effects of the fitness boom, to an aging population, and to higher taxes on alcohol. Meanwhile, the American Medical Association's Code Blue report on the state of health of Americans' youth told us that 50% of high school seniors have used marijuana, 15% have tried cocaine, and many students are steady alcohol users by grade 7. So, this goes on. General fitness in Canadian girls starts to level off and then decline between 14 and 16. For boys, it's between 16 and 18.
I just wanted to clarify what age is grade 7, you said, I think?
15.
Regular users by the age of 15. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, by age 15. Only 24% of the girls achieve a recommended level of fitness, which itself, as I say, is a low standard, in my view. For boys, it's only about 50%. In 1990 alone, 200,000 Canadians, mostly women, had liposuction to machine suck fat from their bodies. Muscular endurance starts to decline at 13 for girls and 17 for boys. And the trend continues to the effect that the relative strength of North American children is declining over time. Now, I submit this is the first time in the history of America, and I'm sure Canada is following suit, and maybe many European countries too, that we have an overall decline in the relative strength of the children in the schools. If we pause to consider the relationship between fitness and working capacity, we can see that a nation of weaker youths is likely going to produce a nation of weaker workers, weaker parents, weaker teachers, and weaker everything. We are becoming a huffing and puffing milquetoast nation, an army of overweight armchair quarterbacks and physically slovenly couch potatoes. By pure default, we are detraining our own children in the public schools. Some parents may be out jogging, but you won't see many kids jogging beside them, at least not where I'm from. In Vanves, the village of Vanves in France, as early as the 1950s, a model study was carried out that ought to have ended all debate. It had school children doing academic work only in the morning and devoting the afternoon to art, music, and sport. Students from these schools ended up superior on every personal, physical, and academic scale. A similar project was tried in the province of Quebec, in Canada. Here's more. In a recent University of Toronto fitness study of 14-year-olds, I just find this shocking. Half the boys and 21 of the 30 girls tested could not do a single chin-up. Students aged 6 to 12 showed the same dismal strength levels. More than 50% of the boys and girls could not, this is not even a chin-up, it's just, maybe the teacher helps them get up to the bar once, 50% of the boys and girls could not hold their chins over a raised bar for more than 10 seconds. Unlike their parents, by the way, who could all do it, and who at that age easily achieved times double or triple that. In the 50-yard dash, the majority were significantly slower than children of the same age 25 years earlier. Professor Gary Reese from University of Michigan says the studies have shown just a steady decline in fitness among U.S. students over the last 2 decades. That was published in 1987 in the Toronto Star. Mandatory Phys Ed was dropped. It used to be mandatory. And by the way, I just got off the phone before the show talking to the fellow who runs the Canadian Association of Independent Private Schools. And I asked him, is sports still mandatory in private schools or is it not? Here was his answer. He said, well, it's not exactly mandatory in that we force students to do sports every day. But it's so popular in our schools and so much a part of the message that we teach and preach that almost all students participate at least in some fitness activity, if not competitive sports. So here we have something which has gone from mandatory to voluntary, but they're relying on the ethos of the school to keep up the student interest. So that was that conversation. That's an update. Even private schools in Canada have given up on mandatory physical fitness and sport. I remember years ago there was this saying about, I think it was about how World War I was won on the playing fields of Eton or something like that. The notion was that vigorous competitive sport prepares young people for vigorous competitive life. So anyway, that's the situation we're in today, and I don't think it's going to go back unless parents get up and demand it. And that's not going to happen, by the way. I don't take this the wrong way, but at one of the private schools my kids are at, I'll never forget, my wife heard her say it, a Chinese lady who had three really bright Chinese kids in the school. She walked in to the principal's office and started giving him hell. For what? And she said, too many activities, too many sports, not enough homework. And the principal said, well, we believe in a well-balanced life here. We believe that mind, body, spirit, and that's how we teach here. I don't care, she says. I want my child to have so much homework he cannot finish it, cannot possibly finish it on any particular day. So stop all these sports, that kind of thing. Well, there's a difference in overall life philosophy, what we're talking about here. If you have enough immigration from countries where people do not share your underlying ethos of your nation, you're going to get this kind of thing, and you won't be able to, organize them to help you insist on it because they don't want it. Anyway, much of the so-called Phys Ed in both Canada and the US is of low caliber. And I don't know again about Europe, but with students spending a lot of their time in a so-called fitness class, standing around, lining up, watching other students do the sport, or just goofing around. Most of them hardly break a sweat. Recent Canadian studies, including one by University of Toronto professor Bob Good, show that only 24% of the time spent in Phys Ed is given to actual physical movement. Of that, much, much less activity is at a level intense enough to produce what a physiologist or coach would call a training effect. And a training effect can only be gained if you're working physically at or above about 80% of your maximum heart rate for a minimum of 20 minutes a day, at least 3 times a week. In one study, obese children moved for only 6 minutes in a 50-minute period. This is the kind of camera experiment I was telling you about, where they just leave them alone, but they film their activity. And this was for only 1 minute intensely, as defined, 80% heart rate. Professors Good and Volpe at University of Toronto state that Canadian children and adolescents are not physically fit. They engage in substantially less physical activity than did their age mates only 2 or 3 decades ago. Children are not only less active, they are fatter and have less heart-lung fitness than do middle-aged joggers. They also quote studies showing that even students 11 to 13 years of age enrolled in ostensible physical education programs either do not change or actually decline in heart-lung fitness. If that isn't a shocker, I don't know what is. That's quite distinct, for example, from something like the National Ballet School of Canada, which is housed in Toronto, where the kids do intensive ballet training, which is very physical training, every day. And they also take an arduous course of studies in addition to their daily workouts. These students showed a steady increase in cardiovascular fitness from age 10 to 17. In contrast, although 96% of our public school youth managed to meet a very low recommended fitness level at age 13, by the end of adolescence, that figure drops to 40%. Okay, so strength and vascular health are declining in the schools while obesity is increasing. By the way, I remember reading some years ago about the Los Angeles Coliseum, which I think they had the 1932 Olympics there, and I think they had, I'm guessing, but somewhere around 100,000 seats. So the time came a few decades ago where they had to remodel the stadium, and I think they had to take out about 20,000, 30,000 seats and put in wider seats because people coming to watch the sports couldn't fit in the 1932 seats any longer. Too uncomfortable, so they had to widen the seats for everybody. Researchers at Louisiana State University have made alarming discoveries through autopsies of very young children who died in car accidents. Dr. David Friedman found children as young as 15 with high cholesterol levels and arterial plaque, and he found fatty streaks, which are precursors to the buildup of plaque in your arteries, in the arteries of 5-year-olds. That was cited in Toronto Star, 1985. Like it wasn't just picked up at random. In a study of 24,000 children, Charles T. Kunzelman, found 41% had high cholesterol levels and 28% high blood pressure. And according to a Tufts University report, about 40% of all fat 7-year-olds will become fat adults, and 70% of obese teenagers will be obese adults. So once the trend has started in child obesity, which is really one of the great nutritional problems of North America, having increased 55% among adults since 1960, and again 40% among children. I haven't kept up with what's happened since 1993 when this book came out, but this chapter caused a bit of a riot of concern in our schools. So there we have it. Early cholesterol in the arteries, early obesity, early inactivity, and I think most shocking of all for any nation serious about the well-being of its citizens, much less stronger than the generation preceding them. And that generation was less strong than the generation preceding them. What else is going along with this turning away from vibrant fitness? Is there a cause for alarm? And I'd say for sure. A Canadian Institute of Child Health report says that from 40 to 50% of school children from grades 4 to 7, again, eat foods high in fat. Again, 9% of them grade 7 students smoke, 15% drink alcohol. I think I already told you that. And that 39% of males and 21% of females have had sex by the age of 14. My bet is that's even lower age today than what it was 30 years ago. Up to 15% of all youth death is from suicide, 5 times as many males as females. And by age 15 to 19, about 11,500 children in Canada, that is, had contracted a notifiable, meaning the medical authorities had to be told, a notifiable sexually transmitted disease. Some picture, I say. Something tells me that those kids could have spent a lot more time in the pool or on the track or the basketball court developing fitness, loyalties to their teammates, and the ideals of fair play instead of developing lung disease, genital warts, and antisocial behavior. Well, the reports are just rolling off the press. Here's a recent report by the U.S. Bureau of Economic Research and Stanford University that compared with their counterparts from the 1960s. This report was published in 92. Compared with their counterparts from the 1960s, contemporary U.S. children were fatter, more suicidal, more murderous, and scored lower on standard academics tests. Enough said. It's a terrible picture. And this being so, I think the question is, how do we explain the colossal incompetence and unwillingness of our paid servants, who are the public school teachers and bureaucracy, to do our bidding and require at least a minimum of effective, vigorous physical education and sport for our children while in their care? After all, thousands of North American private schools do it. Now, as I say, they too have loosened this a little bit, but not entirely. And the spirit of sport and fitness in the schools is set so high that many more of the students kind of want to do it. They see it as a way to be admired in the school. Maybe the answer is to ensure a schooling system that reflects and promotes the private values of the parents and the families of the nation instead of the public values of the educators. Whose kids are they anyway? That's the argument. And my next chapter will outline a solution. And I call that chapter The Solution, which is take back the schools, get them out of the hands of the government. Many people today consider that to be a radical formulation, but I don't. I mean, I've seen lots of studies about literacy and numeracy, for example, illustrating that historical studies showing that in the 1880s and 1890s, insofar as we can get numbers from, say, Upper New York State or New England states, that literacy was at like a 97% level amongst all the citizens. Now, some people today would argue and say, yeah, but, look at what they were reading. Well, I'll tell you what they were reading. They were reading the Bible. They were reading Shakespeare and Milton and other such playwrights and poets and great works of fiction. Not so shabby. They maybe didn't read as much as people do today and have computer screens in front of them all day long, but they were very literate. In the next chapter, I'll explain to you some of the shocking figures on literacy and numeracy in North America, at least. Again, I suspect the standards are higher in countries like France and England, Germany. I know the French baccalaureate is still a pretty distinguished high school diploma, and that compared to it, American high school students are way at the back of the room compared to that standard. However, I don't know what the story is on the bulk of education in those countries. So I've kind of come to an end here on the physical fitness chapter, looking after their bodies. I hope I haven't driven anybody crazy with all the statistics. I only put them in the chapter because I found every one of them quite shocking.
No, I think it's all very interesting. And you asked a question about, we'll actually, if you don't mind, open up for any questions in a moment. So
yes,
please raise your hands, guys, if you have any input or questions or anything. You asked a question about why the system is so incompetent or something along those lines.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. You asked a question about how the system was so incompetent or something along those lines. And I would just posit that, well, it's a multi-layered answer in a way, but not that I have all the answers. But I'll just get to it. So I don't think it's incompetence. I think they're doing it on purpose. I think they want us fat and stupid. But I also think that it's a matter of consent, and I think that in the long run, it's kind of a boiling frog situation. But people are starting to realize maybe a little too late, and it would have been lovely if we'd realized a couple of generations ago and started to stand up and stop consenting to be part of these systems,
Well, you're making a general comment, am I right, about consent in general in the population?
Well, yeah, but I mean, in terms of the schooling and stuff like this, if people were writing more strongly worded letters and threatening to pull their kids out of these schools, then they could get the desired results, i.e.,
right.
enforcement, proper, healthy regimes. I mean, it comes down to, I hate to Bible bash, but bring your child up in the way, or show your child the way it should go, and it will not depart from it in its old age, or something like that. So, and this is part of it. You do need to get some exercise. You can't just be a lazy fat slob. So that's it.
Yeah, well, it's the old problem of the sheeple. Sometimes, God forbid, I've said to people that countries like Canada need a war, something to rejig their value system. You better believe the country would swing into full activity when it comes to the fitness of children if that were the case, because we would be simply shocked at the inability of a 18-year-old boy to do a chin-up, for example. It would bring a reckoning, at least on that score, if not on many others. What would be some of the others? Well, we would cut to the chase, and all this woke nonsense, which is circulating in Western societies at this time, and all this nonsense about how a girl who thinks she's a boy gets to use certain pronouns. By the way, in Canada, I forget his name, but there was a fellow who actually got a jail sentence and a $30,000 fine. I'm talking about at some point in the last 6 months. I mean, I'm going to follow it up. He got a 6 months jail sentence and a $30,000 fine for referring to his daughter as his daughter and for using the pronouns her and she. This actually happened, as far as I can tell. I want to research it myself to prove it, but it seems to be the case. Now, what kind of strange world are we moving in where, take for example, Bruce Jenner. In 1976, I was a color commentator for Canadian, what's called the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They had the rights to film the Olympic Games in Montreal, and they asked me to do the color commentary on the men's field events and the decathlon. And I did all the comments on Bruce Jenner's amazing gold medal decathlon performance in those games. It's not like I knew him personally, but you better believe I went into shock when I heard that he had decided that his true self was female, that he was in the wrong body and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, what happened to him, he went on to dress like a woman and took God knows what kinds of hormones and did who knows what kinds of surgery. Now, the issue with me was not that he shouldn't be free to do that if he wants, but it was the approbation of the media. For example, here was Bruce Jenner, clearly born a man, clearly still a man, being referred to by the newspapers and the television as she and her, when everybody knows there's no she there. It's just in his mind. Now, if Bruce had come out and said he thought he was Napoleon, you know, walked around with his hand in his shirt like that, making speeches like Napoleon, we'd probably lock him up. But for some reason, he's free to walk around saying that he's a woman when he's not. So maybe I don't understand enough about this situation, but I find it incredibly weird that the whole society would capitulate to this individual's will. And now I'm going to say that if you ask me what the driving force behind so much contemporary social change is, I would say that the notion of the personal will has replaced the older notion of the personal soul. So there's so many atheists out here now and so many non-believers. You start talking about the soul and people are just going to go to sleep. Unless you're in a church or something, they're going to go to sleep. But it's okay to talk about what you want, about your will, and how your will should determine everything in existence that matters to you. And this is coming through in public discussions in phrases having the word choice in them. So, for example, my body, my choice, says the woman who wants to basically abort her own child. She wasn't raped, and many people will say for cases of violent rape, we can let that go and abortion is okay. Some people say not even that. But this is a woman who had sex voluntarily. She wants the father to have nothing to do with her child, and or she wants to abort the child. So somebody says, what right do you have to kill the baby in your womb? And she says, my body, my choice. And even our own Prime Minister Trudeau, the father of our present Prime Minister, he heard this woman say this in public. And he looked her right in the eye and he said, the trouble is we're talking about somebody else's body, not your body. And that stopped her immediately. The reason I bring that up is because how come newspaper readers and listeners to TV and all the rest of it are accepting the capitulation of media to the will of citizens who are saying absolutely crazy things that they would have been locked up for not so long ago. And they would still be locked up for if they walked around insisting that they were Napoleon or Julius Caesar or whatever. And I think it comes down to the question of the will. Oh, we don't want to touch him. Oh, we don't want to argue. Oh, we don't want to resist what they really want. It's what they really want, you know. And so, as I say, the will, capital W, is the chief factor, I think, in so much of the weirdness that we see in modern society. Take the whole question of the choice of pronouns. People are walking around saying, willing that you call them only by certain pronouns. Now language has never operated that way in all of human history. Language is kind of a communal product of human interaction in society. It's not like any one individual has got to change or alter the rules of grammar. The rules of grammar in English, for example, exist independently of every user of the language, although they control what we say. So here we have a kind of subconscious controlling device called English grammar, which makes us understandable to each other. It's not a question of the will. You don't get to redefine what a verb or an adjective or an adverb is. That has preceded you. You have to come on stream with those conclusions. But today it's all turned upside down. My body, my choice, and so on and so on. And so I think future generations are going to look back at this one and say, what was the cause of that? What was the cause of what people like me call hyper-individualism? This idea that communal beliefs, the common good of mankind, humankind, no longer matter. What matters is my will and my choice and my rights, that I want everything by right as I will it to be. I can't insist strongly enough that this is the underappreciated moving force behind so much social change in our midst.
William, we actually have a question waiting for you. I've got one for you, but I'll let Ayaz go ahead first, if that's all right. Yeah, Ayaz, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead.
Pardon me?
Oh, no, well, sorry, I was just saying there's a member of the chat here. He has a question for you, if that's all right, William. Yeah, okay, so Ayaz, please unmute yourself.
You want me to unmute myself?
Yeah, hello, William. Nice to see an elderly gentleman advising the younger ones. I think that's a very, very big missing picture nowadays in the West. Much appreciate for the group to invite an experienced person. I'm sorry I didn't quote the whole conversation from the beginning. However, my question would be, do you think, and from your observations, that we are inflicted with gender wars where male and female used to complete each other you see, I'm kind of in the middle age. I'm 44, so I seen my older generation and I observe the younger generation now. And I think, and I want your opinion on this, that do you think there is a gender war by design? So where two genders, males and females, are competing with each other rather than complementing and completing each other. And also, if you do believe that, and of course the promotion of transgender, and I don't know where the ball will stop, but what do you think the overall consequence of such behavior would be on the long run, William? And thank you for listening.
Thank you for asking the question. It's very interesting. But I think you need to go farther. There's not just a few new genders on the table. There's hundreds of them. I think Facebook, and I'm not a Facebook member, but I read somewhere that when you sign up for Facebook, there's 54 genders, and you check the box, whichever one or ones plural that you are. So this thing kind of fits into what I was saying earlier. Hyper-individualism. Okay, let me back up. If you're going to think of a healthy society, you have to think of a molecule. And the molecule is very complex, but it's formed of all the atoms. Molecules are created from atoms. In the metaphor for a human society, the molecule is the social groupings of society. That could be the whole nation, if you're speaking of the nation, rather than the individuals in the nation. It could be the family, it could be a sports club, or a bridge club, or a political party, any number of molecules like that, which consist of the individual human beings that choose to be part of that molecule. And I don't want to go too far afield here, but in the life of most societies, how you behave, especially in a democracy, by the way, the idea was that if you're going to vote, you should vote for the molecule, not the atom. In other words, you should vote for the common good, not just for yourself. Now, this is a very interesting question, because I'm asking you, are we now at a point in the, I'm not going to call it the evolution, because evolution implies progress of some kind. It's better to call it a mutation. So Western life has mutated very rapidly to the point where all the molecules are being smashed open and the individual atoms are buzzing around, all shouting about their rights and what they want, and insisting on the exercise of their own will over other people doing the very same thing. And so it's not surprising that we have this plethora of genders out there, as if gender was something created by choice rather than by biology, you see. Now, isn't that interesting? Because if who I am has to do with who I choose to be, that's a very abstract notion, just like the notion of the soul, which no one talks about anymore because they don't know anything about that idea. But the idea of the self and the personal will has replaced the idea of the soul. And it's just as abstract as the concept of the soul is. I think it was Aquinas and Aristotle, basically, when asked what human beings are, he said we are embodied souls, you see. And this, again, is a question which very much interests me because I do think we are spiritual in that sense. And this is not crazy talk. It's the idea that doing even the simplest thing, like lifting your finger, you know, when I ask my friends who are strict materialists, raise your finger, and they do that, I said, how did you do it? They look at me like I'm crazy. What do you mean, how do I do it? I said, well, how did you raise your finger? And they go into this claptrap about how, well, there's neurons in the brain, and they fire a signal which travels down the nerve or whatever to the finger, and the finger goes up. And I say, yeah, but the neuron or the nerve didn't make that decision. Neurons are not thinking. They're just obeying. And what they're obeying is the thought that you just had to raise your finger. And thoughts are abstract. So, in other words, mind may depend on brain for its existence, but it is not brain. Now, by the way, there was a famous Canadian neurophysiologist in the 30s and 40s named Wilder Penfield. He's worth looking up because he came to the conclusion after trying for decades to figure out where the mind was in the brain, and he couldn't. And he ended up concluding, he said he went from being a materialist to being a Platonist or something like that, because he said he tried in every way that he could by stimulating the brain, often when patients were awake, by the way, so he got immediate results from them. He said they often gave me, tastes, fears, angers, other emotions and things like that. But there was nothing even close to approximating what we would call the working of the human mind. So as a hard scientist, he ended his life with the conclusion that mind and brain are essential to each other, but they're separate entities, they're separate realities. And it's still hard to get a materialistic friend to agree that when he raises his finger, it's a thought that is doing that. And then they say, so what? It's a thought. I say, well, it's very important because the thought is abstract. It's non-material. You can't measure it. It has no weight or height or depth or substantial quiddity. It's just an abstract notion. And that's aside from the autonomic purposes of your body, like breathing, thinking, eating, whatever, and all the rest of that stuff, which occur without the will, the voluntary acts of the human being begin with an abstraction. Now, ancient people called that the spirit or the soul. Today, we pretty much avoid that question. It's hard to find anybody, say, in a modern university, who would agree that there just may be something abstract and wholly conceptual that is at the heart of human action. So do the finger trick with them and ask them to raise their finger. And then how did they do that? They will do everything they can to avoid saying that it was due to an abstract thought that they were able to raise their finger. They'll give you all kinds of business about, associationism and stimulus and response and all that sort of thing from the meager sciences they've been studying. But in the end, you've got them pinned down, because so many things that humans do begin with their thoughts.
Yeah, sorry, can I just pose a further question into this? Do you think our kids and ourselves, of course, from the very beginning, when we are beginning from school, they have deliberately turned our minds and heads and eyes and fixated onto certain things that they want us to learn and not to explore anything that is beyond the physical?
Yes, I do. I think that Western society is profoundly materialistic in that sense. And of course, this came out of earlier thinkers like Bacon, who kind of invented the experimental method, and that's just continued throughout our society. And most people, as I say, would simply not hear you or think you were a little nuts if you tried to make the argument that human action is sparked by an abstract thought and not by something physical. They'll think you're a little cuckoo. But when you ask them to prove how their finger was lifted, sometimes you can get them to admit that it's an abstract thought that made it possible. The whole of Western society is profoundly materialistic, and that's been good in some senses. I mean, we got to the moon that way. We invented all kinds of medicines and so on, which have contributed to the relief of human suffering and all these kinds of things, which might not have happened if we had remained a wholly immaterialist country or people philosophically. We probably would be wandering in the desert with our prayer books. I don't know. I'm just saying, I think it's gotten one-sided, and it's a shame that young people today are not introduced to these controversies. They're real philosophical and psychological controversies as between materialism and things non-material. And it's a shame that these discussions are simply shut down in the classroom or trampled. And, you're not going to get a discussion in any regular school that I know of. Maybe on a special philosophy class in university, you might.
Thanks very much, William. I'll be brief because I'm conscious of time, and I can also see that Nath is waiting to ask a question. I did have a question earlier. It was relating to when you mentioned about this conviction for the father who had misgendered his daughter or some rubbish.
Yes.
Not that you were talking rubbish, but, prosecution was rubbish. I was going to ask you if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, but I'm sure you are. He rose to fame, around the same sort of topics about this kind of being forced to conform to other people's wishes about how they want to be addressed. So I'd just be interested to ask you, when you do find out more about this as you follow it, to know if it's the same legislation that he was speaking out against. So with that, I want to thank you very much. Do you have time for one more question from Nath?
Sure. Thank you. By the way, Jordan Peterson is a colleague. I wouldn't say a close friend, but we know each other, shake hands and all that. He's done some wonderful things, and I hope he keeps doing them.
hope so too. Over to you, Nath. Thanks for being patient with us. Let's allow you to speak.
Yeah. I had the word deliberate in my mind, and I had said it.
It's hard to hear.
Sorry. The word deliberate I had in my mind that I wanted to ask, but it was kind of just answered. So it's been a deliberate attack over the generations and weakening the generations as children, and that's how they grow into weak men and women.
Yes, that's a statement, not a question. I'm happy to agree with you. I think it is. I think it is. And but my interest has always been in looking for what I call the ideological substructures of human existence. And if you don't mind the flagrant self-promotion, I'll just explain what I mean by that. My last political book was called The Great Divide. And in it, I explained to readers, who want to know what it's about. I said, well, imagine a man coming out of his house into the street, and suddenly the ground starts to shake, and bricks are falling from buildings and glass, and buildings are crumbling. And the first thing he says to himself is, oh my God, it's an earthquake. But I say to him, no, that's not the earthquake. It's the consequences of the earthquake. The real earthquake is way below the ground where you can't see it, in the rubbing of the tectonic plates and all that kind of stuff, miles below the surface. What you're seeing is the consequences or the rubble of the earthquake. Oh, interesting, he says. And I said, well, this book is the same. I'm interested in finding out, discovering what the real ideological forces are, which are out of sight for most of us, that are causing the ideological and emotional and philosophical rubble at the surface of our society. And again, if you don't mind the self-promotion, I would really urge your listeners to go get that book, because you'll see what I mean. And that's why the subtitle of the book is Why Liberals and Conservatives Will Never, Ever Agree. And the reason is there can be no agreement on the forces that are working below the surface, the ideological conflicts that we have. I'll just give you one example. There's a chapter in the book on human nature. Well, almost every conservative worth his salt would say that human nature is pretty much fixed and determined over time. It never really changes. And we see that idea in Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, Edmund Burke, and all the way up to the present. A true conservative will believe that. And he will also believe that we are probably imperfect beings, and therefore there can be no such thing as a perfect government. And so the true conservative will be opposed to all revolutionary movements that are trying to overturn the present and replace it with something more perfect. Whereas the modern liberal, and I distinguish the modern liberal from the classical liberal, the classical liberal was interested in individual liberty, property rights, and equality before the law and in the eyes of God. But that was the only equality that he or she was interested in. The modern liberal, which is the foil that I use in this book, is interested in forced equality. Very different from the classical liberal, for whom equality is not forced. It's an aspect of life which is applied to all equally, and it's a start line, what I call a start line philosophy, where we try to get everybody to the same starting line and we fire the gun. But who gets to the finish line first? That's up to them as individuals. We don't try to give them all a gold medal, even though they didn't finish together, and call them all the winner, even though there was only one winner. Now, that's a very modern, very recent distortion of the notion of liberalism. At any rate, back to the question of human nature, the modern liberal, unlike the classical liberal, will say that human nature is completely malleable. human nature can be changed. That's why we have laws. That's why we have public policies. That's why we have schools. The whole idea is to change human nature. And when they say change, they don't mean change it for the worse. They mean change it for the better. In other words, they are rampantly idealist. And as we have seen in my previous talks, they want to rejig the curricula in the schools, brainwash the kids and the teachers with this idea that the whole reason that there are public schools is to perfect society, to create what they call change agents who will make society into something much better than what it is today. And I'll just finish by saying that you can't put those two ideological positions together. They can't be married. Either human nature is more or less fixed over time, we are imperfect beings, and therefore no government or no society can be made perfect. And then the liberal position is that, in fact, human nature is completely malleable, and we can change ourselves and everybody around us with the object of creating the perfect society or the perfect world. That's what international communism was all about. And as I said before, I think in one of these talks, when Marshal Zhukov, I hope that was his name, he was quoted in Time magazine, when the Berlin Wall fell and communism collapsed so quickly. Time magazine did an interview with this guy, who was on the front lines. And he said basically, what the hell were you doing? You know what he said? He said, the kingdom of heaven on earth before the third millennium, that was our objective. Just memorize those words. This guy wanted the kingdom of heaven, not in heaven, because he was an atheist, like all communists, but on earth. Now, this is called the secularization thesis, where people who believe this kind of thing, a lot of modern liberals are this way, even if they're not communists yet. They believe that they are trying to create a more perfect world, the kingdom of heaven on earth. Of course, the conservatives say you can't do that because we're not perfect. There's going to be imperfection, sin, call it what you want, at every turn in the road. Yeah, not that we can't fix some things, make them a little better. But I think there's an old French saying, if I can remember it properly, that says that the perfect is the enemy of the best. That we may do something that's best for today, but not that's perfect, not possible. And that actually will end up destroying all our efforts to gradually improve how we live. So anyway, that book, The Great Divide, is about these conflicts between the true conservative and the modern liberal in every chapter. And if you want to examine where you stand, there's a little diagram at the end of every chapter where you can go through all the choices that you're asked to make and figure out where you stand yourself. I think it's the only book I've ever seen where this is made so clearly possible.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've really enjoyed that. Sorry for my little sort of mess up at the beginning. I think next time what I'll do is I'll give you a message if I'm covering for Harry, and ask you to send me a rough idea of how you'd like me to introduce you, and I'll just kind of ad lib from there rather than.
Sorry, quickly, you talking to me now?
Yeah. No, because I messed up at the beginning, I felt, and next time I'll do better, but I'll message you beforehand, and that's just me being self-conscious. Beyond that,
I finally figured out how to find the right.
Yeah, well, warmed up in the end. It was just me being a bit self-conscious and silly. So sorry about that. And thanks so much for coming on. Regarding your books, sir, by all means, send me some links as to where you, where that's stocked. If it's just anywhere, just send me a list of the books and we'll promote.
Well, here's the deal. If you circulate my website address to your listeners, and they go to my website and they click books, all my books will appear. And if they want to order one, they can do it right from the website. Okay,
just send me the link then if you like, and I'll pop that on with the recording.
Yeah, it's just my name, williamgairdner.ca.
I'll find it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for today. Look forward to next week.
I'll stop the recording and wish you, I'd say good night, but it's far from night time where you are.
Yeah.
All right,
Hey,
God
thanks
bless.
so much.
Thanks, William.
Take care.